Here in the chapter 21.3 subsection of Global Poverty chapter, we're going to be taking a look at the impact of economic growth on its potential to reduce poverty. Let's first of all take a look at a quote from the World Bank. It says, developing nations hold the keys to their prosperity. Global action cannot substitute for equitable and efficient domestic policies and institutions. The World Bank follows a very economist-oriented line on this particular issue. Most economists do not believe that, in fact, external factors like NGOs or government foreign aid programs can possibly make a big enough dent in poverty in third world nations, and oftentimes even contribute, especially with the government transfers of resources called foreign aid, oftentimes do actually more damage than good to the receiving countries because they tend to finance corrupt elites in those nations. So the World Bank is now suggesting that the developing nations have to work out their own internal problems and have economic growth as the solution to poverty. So let's remind ourselves about a couple of things. In developed countries, we're pretty much, as the slide points out, is into brain power, otherwise known as we are post-industrial societies, we're knowledge societies, where our technology and the educated workforce combined is what makes for a very prosperous society. But in poverty-stricken nations, the needs are far more basic. They need the brick and mortar elements of an economy, such as access to food, water systems, roads, schools, legal systems, markets, and other opportunities. Now, of course, I'm just reading off the slide there to you, but it's just a quick reminder that in many countries around the world, the basics, especially infrastructure basics, just don't exist, or they don't exist on anywhere near enough scale necessary for the country to develop properly. So, if we get those things straightened out, we can have an expansion of the production possibilities of a society, and therefore everyone, both the rich, the middle class, and the poor, all gain income. And if we do so, then obviously the folks at the very bottom can escape absolute poverty. Is this even possible? Well, there's two arguments to suggest it is. First of all, every rich first world nation today, that would include the United States, Canada, all of Western Europe, New Zealand, Australia, Japan, Singapore, Hong Kong. I'm not going to make a list of literally every single modern rich nation, but you get the point quickly that there are a bunch of nations scattered around the world that have made it to what we call first world status. Now, where were those countries 150 years ago? They were all poor. The United States was poorer than Nigeria is today on a per capita basis only 150 years ago. So obviously the United States managed to get out of it, so we do know it's possible for nations to escape grinding poverty. To a more modern example, this one actually deals with what China has accomplished in roughly the last 30 years or so. Now, for you younger folks, which I'm assuming most of you all are probably in your 30s, late 20s, early 30s, certainly not my age, I'm in my mid-60s. If you are in your 30s or younger, you will have lived a life during which China has been a major world exporter. In other words, you pick up a product from Walmart, and where does it say it's made? Made in China, right? And so many people are used to thinking of China as a modern manufacturing nation. Well, I can remember when I was you all's age, when I was in my 20s, China was still being ruled by hardcore communist ideology. Mao Zedong was still alive. He was the freedom fighter that won the revolution to make China communist. And there were no private initiative of any kind, no privately owned farms, no privately owned businesses. Imports and exports were tightly controlled by the government, and China's GDP per capita, or their income per person, was incredibly low, lower than Nigeria's is today. So China, during my youth, we're talking in the 1970s and early 80s, China was a very, very poor country, one of the poorest in the world. And starting in the late 1970s, beginning of the 1980s, after Mao Zedong died, new leadership came into the Communist Party, and they started to reform. Now, of course, they haven't completely reformed, but they made major reforms. They permitted both Chinese people to start owning their own businesses, plus they let foreigners come to China and open up and own businesses. So the business environment in China has been much more opened toward capitalism than it was in my youth. And of course, we've seen the result. China has had economic growth between 8 to 10% annually for decades. So in the last 30 years, China has had major economic growth. And here's the interesting statistic from the World Bank. The extreme version of global poverty, that means the less than $1.90 or $2.15 in more modern prices, below $2, let's call it a nice easy round number. The below $2 group of people in the world was 30% of the total world's population in 1990. It shrank to only 10% in 2019. And this was due almost entirely to China's economic growth. So China knocked down the entire world's poverty rate from 30% to 10% just from its own economic growth. Our point here, of course, is if countries can get their growth untracked, they can do the same thing. And that's what this set of lectures is going to be about. Let's use two examples to illustrate some important fundamental facts of life that we need to recognize. This example I'm using is completely made up, just so we don't hurt the feelings of anyone from any particular country. We're going to look at two countries, Alpha and Omega, and in both countries we have obviously production and we have population. Let's take a look at Alpha's first. Total population in 1980 is 1 million people. Total production is $1 billion. So the per capita GDP, or GDP divided by population, is $1,000. Very poor country. Now, let's fast forward to 2020. The income, or rather the total population, has doubled from 1 million to 2 million, but look at the GDP. It went from 1 billion to 6 billion. So even though the number of people increased dramatically, the numerator on that fraction of GDP divided by population grew even faster. So what was the final 2020 GDP per capita? It was $3,000. Clearly, this country is getting wealthier. So you would expect that the people in its lowest economic strata within its country, the number of people falling below the $2 per day limit becomes smaller and smaller and smaller. So they're earning their way out or growing their way out of poverty. But let's take a look at the country of Omega. Omega is a bigger country, has 2 million people, but a much bigger economy. It has $4 billion, so it has an average GDP per capita of $2,000 per person back in 1980. So still a very poor country, certainly by American standards or first world standards, but a very poor country, but not as poor as Alpha. But let's take a look at what happens to Omega over the next 40 years. Total population goes from 2 million up to 6 million. The total economy goes from 4 million to 8 million. You notice I've picked nice easy round numbers so we can see the population tripled, but the GDP only doubled. So now when you do your GDP divided by population in the final formula for 2020, we have what? $8 trillion worth of economy divided by 6 million people. Per capita GDP actually declined from $2,000 per person down to $1,333 per person. So within that country, what do you think is happening to the number of people falling below the $2 per day limit? It's actually increasing, isn't it? Now we have something to consider. In order for economic growth to make a difference in per capita GDP and thereby reduce the total number of people falling below the extreme poverty line, you need to make sure that your economic growth is faster than your population growth. If that's true, per capita GDP rises. But if population growth is faster than GDP growth, even if your economy is growing, but not growing fast enough, then you're spreading a larger economy over even larger numbers of people, then obviously the average for each person has to be going down. And so therefore the number of people falling into poverty would increase. So let's talk about some things that can make a difference. If we're not going to do foreign donations of the donations from one country to another that we call foreign aid, and we're not going to do NGOs, then what can we do? Now we're talking about actually changing the ability of the country itself to produce its own goods and services. Remember from the very beginning of our semester, we talked about the need for human capital. That's the ability of people to their training and their skill that makes them more productive. Let's take a look at some data on education. Only 71% of the population in low-income countries completes elementary school, meaning almost 30%, 29% of the population in low-income countries does not even complete elementary school. So when I was using examples earlier, talking about how even in the United States, even an air conditioning repair person has a tremendous amount of education to be able to understand the wiring diagrams and whatnot, how to fix your air conditioner. In a third world nation, the number of people who have even what we consider to be working class skills, they don't even have that. So it's very, very difficult for factory owners to want to move to a very poor country because even the basic skills don't exist. So one of the things that's clearly important is education needs to be ramped up in poor nations to get people up to some basic level of understanding. We see that there's a major problem for young women in particular. In the more poor a country is, the less chance that women will be educated. And why is this a big deal? Well, even if you're not a feminist and don't really care about women per se, you have to recognize that when young women are not in the labor force, they tend to have a lot more children. Because if you're not going to work, well, and you're not highly educated, having children is a natural byproduct of that, right? And so what we tend to find is population growth tends to be highest in the nations where women are not educated. And as we've already pointed out on the previous slide, even if you don't care about women at all, you might care about the fact that if people are having lots of children, even if your economy is growing, it may not be able to grow fast enough for the average in the population to rise. So that's my point. Even when you don't care about women, you need to care about women. So in this particular example, this is something that many countries need to overcome that have very difficult cultural issues for women. Health. Health is something that we don't tend to think about as an economic issue. We mostly think about it as a fairness issue. Do the poor have access to health care? But when you're talking about economic development, health actually is a very, very important issue. When workers are constantly sick because the water and sanitation facilities are in short supply, so water is constantly contaminated with microbes and people are constantly getting dysentery and diarrhea and all kinds of stomach ailments and can't come to work, it has a major impact on economic productivity. All of these things, I'm not going to go through the entire list, you can read them yourself. I just wanted you all to recognize that health itself in poor nations becomes an economic concern for can the population actually work hard enough to be economically productive. Now let's talk about capital investment. We talked about that in first world nations as being very important. This is very important for all nations because as we pointed out earlier, human strength is quite meager. We are one of the weakest animals on the planet. So we aren't rich and productive because we're strong. We're rich and productive because we're smart. And we invent all kinds of machines like John Deere tractors to pull the plows rather than trying to pull the plow with a horse, which works, but it's a very unproductive way to do it. So the more capital equipment that you can put into your society and have the trained workers who know how to operate it and fix that capital, the more productive your nation becomes, the higher its GDP becomes, and then that GDP divided by per capita ratio ends up having a much higher income per person, and therefore you end up reducing the total number of people falling below the extreme poverty line. Now, it turns out that in many poor nations, agriculture is one of the biggest industries because, like I said, they don't have mechanical industries to a large extent, so many people, way more than in the United States, live on a farm and are farm workers. Now, farm work is very unproductive when done by hand, but could become very productive if it can be mechanized and you can increase productivity. And that's where the capital investment comes in, because the United States went through the exact same thing. In colonial days, Americans plowed using a horse and a hoe and reaped wheat with a scythe by hand. All of that stuff was done very unproductively. And then during the Industrial Revolution, we have John Deere tractors, the International Harvester, and all the different farm equipment that gets invented, which speeds up productivity of farm workers dramatically. And that's part of where the United States got the wherewithal to do a full industrialization. We also mechanized farming.